This is a reading from the 8th Psalm. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what are mere mortals that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them? You have made them a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet, all flocks and herds, and the animals of the wild, the birds in the sky and the fish in the sea, all that swim the paths of the seas. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. There are some theologians who consider human beings to be co-creators with God. And when you read something like the 8th Psalm, it is difficult to see how, seeing as how it is not the work of my fingers to create the moon and the stars. But I was reminded of one way in which this is true. Earlier this week, I was in a conversation with several friends, all of whom are involved in ministry. And somebody turned to one of them and asked, when was the first time that you gave a message in meeting? And this person was a pastor's child. She was very involved in the church from the time that she was small, 8 or 9. And so I think the person who asked her this was, well, when I expected an answer, when I was 12, I gave my first message. When I was 14, I gave my first message. She said, I remember it very well. I was one of those people who was involved in ministry and had never given a message, and I was beginning to wonder whether I'd ever give a message. I think that she was in her 30s. She remembers the exact day on which it occurred. And I got to thinking about the first time that I ever spoke in meeting for worship. I was in seminary. I had been a photojournalist before I went to seminary. I had been a Quaker for about 6 years. I wondered whether I would ever speak in worship. And the first 2 messages I ever gave, both in the spring of the same year, were about developing film. And when she talked about her first message, I thought about my first message on something called latent image. And I thought about how it's really talking about the work of co-creation with God. So it is possible that some of you are not really familiar with how film works. It seems possible. I am assuming that almost all of you, although not necessarily all of you, but almost all of you know what film is. Now, I couldn't necessarily assume that in any congregation that I want to speak to, but I think in our congregation, with the possible exception of Jessica Strafford, that we all know what film is.
Thanks, Dan.
So back in those glory days of film, you had this canister film that you put in your camera and you strung it across the shutter plane, closed the back of the camera, did some things with your lens, went out, took some pictures, came back, rolled up your film, took it to the drugstore, and miraculous things happened and you didn't know why. More or less, I think that's the process. So more miraculous things happened than you're actually aware of, though. So film starts out on a film base. It is the thing on which the silver is spread. And if you think about Civil War photographs, they were on a base of glass, which is why sometimes when you see them printed, there are cracks in them. It's because the glass has cracked. If you think about daguerreotypes and tintypes, they were on a base of metal. If you think about the photographs that you get back from the drugstore, they are on a base of paper. And if you think about the negatives that you also used to get back from the drugstore, those are on a base of plastic, a particular kind of plastic called celluloid. So you start out with this material, almost like a piece of plywood, except it happens to be celluloid. And then you spread an emulsion on the top of it. And the emulsion is basically Jell-O, processed in a different form, more solid Jell-O than we would eat, but it's Jell-O. And it's Jell-O with what are called silver salts in it, 3 different forms of silver. Not quite silver, almost silver, molecules with the potential to be silver salts. And they're spread throughout this emulsion, and then the emulsion is painted onto the base. So the silver salts have the property of reacting in a physical chemical way to light. And when they're exposed to light, something in their electron band gets elevated and they become closer to silver than they were before. They're not quite silver yet, but they're silver salts with the potential to become silver in a way that the silver salts that weren't exposed to light don't have that potential to become silver. And so in order to turn that potential in the silver salts to actual silver, you use liquid chemicals called developer that wash over the emulsion on top of the base and take those molecules with the potential to become silver and transform them into actual silver. And so what you wind up with at the end of this process is a piece of plastic with silver molecules coating it of various depths. And it's the thickness of the silver molecules that eventually winds up projecting the image into the world that we see as a photographic image. But the really fascinating thing is that every one of these kind of elements imparts its own impression on the image. Whether the gelatin emulsion is placed over glass or over metal or over paper or over transparent plastic affects what is eventually projected into the world. The easiest way for you to know that this were true is if you ever took an intro to photography class and they made you have a paper negative. When you project the paper negative, not only do you see the thing you took a photograph of, you also see the grain of the paper because that has now become a part of the image. The silver emulsion has its own properties, depending on whether you want it to be more sensitive to light or less sensitive to light. You can make the silver halides, the silver salts, coarser or finer. The coarser they are, the more they'll respond to light, but the more they will also potentially screw up your final image by being really thick and sandy. The finer they are, the more in focus your image will look like it is, but it won't be nearly as sensitive to the world around it. The developer magnifies all of those effects. The developer can make it, can enable you to make images of things that are very dark, or it can dial back on that and allow you to make images of things that are very bright. It can magnify the effect of the film grain. It can diminish the effect of the film grain. As a newspaper photojournalist, I was very familiar with what we used to call pushing our film, which means that you take it and you make it perform beyond its capacity to perform by the kind of developer that you use and the amount of time that you give it. So all of these things, this kind of final image that becomes the photograph that we see is formed by all these various parts, some of which are given and cannot be changed, like the film base and the emulsion, and some of which are not given and can be changed, like the light of exposure to the world and the impact of the developer, the kind of developer that you use and the amount of time that you give it. And so it struck me when I first talked about latent image, and even more powerfully now, that this is really an excellent way of understanding one of the ways in which we are co-creators with God. God forms us with a film base and an emulsion, with our kind of inherited characteristics, our physical characteristics, our spiritual and mental characteristics, our gifts and capacities. The photograph is the us that we project into the world, our kindness or lack of kindness, our generosity, our thriftiness, our ability to tell jokes, our complete inability to tell jokes, all of those things, that's part of the photograph of ourselves that we project into the world. The strange thing is that we are both the photograph and the developer, that we are part of what determines how this film becomes us. God gives us the film and the silver salts, and we decide the silver that we will become. The author, Roberta Bondi, talks about a particular way of seeing human beings that was developed by the very early Christian teachers. And she talks about the difference that they saw between temperament and disposition. I think that this is a distinction that the church lost in the Middle Ages and up through most of the modern age. And I wish it had hung on to it, because it talks a lot about what we need to do to be faithful. So Roberta Bondi writes, the distinction between a temperament and a disposition is instructive at this point. We are more or less born with our temperament, and it persists as we grow up from childhood to adulthood, pretty much on its own, though parents, teachers, and friends may try to modify it. The word temperament here describes the underlying characteristic and apparently natural attitude a person has toward the world: cheerful, violent, loving, thoughtful, grudging, and so forth. But temperament is not the same as disposition, for disposition has to do with a chosen and cultivated long-term attitude of heart. Even having a loving temperament is not the same as having a loving disposition, for one can have a loving temperament and still be quite thoughtless, even irresponsible toward others. What she goes on to talk about throughout this book, which is called To Love as God Loves, is the way that the choices that we make about who we are going to be, in particular, what kind of disciples we're going to be, not necessarily how we feel about God, but how we act because of God, that's crucial to who we are as people of faith. And so I think that in this metaphor of film, the difference between us and an actual piece of celluloid coated with silver salts, I mean, obviously there are many, many differences, but at a metaphorical level, the difference is that the photographer dealing with a piece of film with silver salts on it, based on experience and planning, decides that at a certain point of time, it has developed enough. And stops the development process and then fixes the image in time with a chemical called fixer. And what that means is that for all time now, this image will be this image. It has been fixed. It's always going to be the same. When we think about our potential, our latent image, it is never fixed. It is always changing. And the crucial thing is that we're changing it by who we decide to be, by the choices we make about whether we want to be forgiving or vengeful, whether we want to be grateful or grudging, whether we are more concerned with justice or with mercy, or somehow with both, with mercy having the edge. And the other thing that I think is interesting about thinking about film and latent image and how we develop ourselves to be in the world is that at a certain point in our lives, around about the time that we decide that we can accept ourselves as who we are, with our strengths and our weaknesses, that we can say with Papa, I am what I am, and that's all that I am. Right about that time, it's kind of easy to decide that what we are is the film and the emulsion that God handed to us when we were born. And there's not much that we can do about it. I'm a grouch and a curmudgeon, and that's just the way God made me. Whether or not my family is happy about that. But if I consider that I'm not the film, that I'm the film plus the developer, and no matter how old and crotchety I get to be, I'm still in charge of the developer, then every single day, whether I'm a grouchy person or not, I can get up and say, today I choose not to be grouchy. Whether I tend to respond to other people's accomplishments with encouragement or with envy, I can get up this morning and say, today I'm going to do my best to be discouraging, to be encouraging. And if I catch myself wanting to say something that might be discouraging, I can say, why would I say that? It's a choice. It's a choice I can make every single day. I'm not too old for it. I'm not too much who I am to be able to project a different me into the world, to become a different image, to create with God what that image will be. I think that that's a worthwhile endeavor for every day, to decide what image of myself will I project into the world, not as in I'm not really this person, but as in my actions in the world today show this. What will I be today?